She's pregnant, but her husband asked her to donate blood to his mistress. She demanded a divorce, and he regrets it. Hi, my beloved story family. Welcome to Mr. Peter Stories. Happy 2025 to all the story lovers out there. May this year bring you captivating tales, inspiring characters, and unforgettable adventures. Keep reading and dreaming. Today, I want to share something from my heart. Lately, I've been feeling a little unsure, wondering if my stories still touch you the way they used to. When my last video had fewer comments, it made me question if I'm doing enough to inspire and connect with you. Every story I share comes from a place of love and passion, and your feedback means the world to me. If my stories have brought you joy, please write yes in the comments. And if there's anything I can improve, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You are my family, and your support keeps me going. Thank you for being here. It means everything. Now let's begin today's story. The morning light filtered through the frosted bathroom window of the Roberts Beacon Hill mansion, casting a golden glow on Annika Rose Roberts as she stood motionless before the marble vanity. In her trembling hands, she held a white plastic stick that would forever change her life. A positive pregnancy test. The two pink lines seemed to pulse with possibility, with promise, with the future she and Alessandro had dreamed of since their wedding 3 years ago. Tears of joy streamed down her dark cheeks, leaving glistening trails that caught the light. Dr. Annika Rose Roberts, Chief of Trauma Surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital, was known for her steady hands and unshakable composure in the operating room. But now, those same hands that had saved countless lives trembled with the weight of the miracle growing within her. She placed the test carefully on the counter, bracing herself against the cool marble as memories flooded her mind. The night she first met Alessandro Roberts, CEO of Roberts Pharmaceuticals, hadn't been romantic at all. It had been chaotic, bloody, and life-altering in ways neither of them could have predicted. The car accident had left him barely clinging to life when they wheeled him into her trauma bay. His Ferrari had wrapped around a tree on Storrow Drive, the impact so severe that the first responders had needed the jaws of life to extract him. Annika remembered the determined focus that had taken over as she worked to save him, her hands moving with practiced precision as she called out orders to her team. Multiple internal injuries, possible pneumothorax, severe blood loss, she had rattled off, not knowing or caring who the handsome man on her operating table was. All that mattered was saving his life. For 13 hours, she had fought death itself, refusing to give up, even when others suggested calling time of death. When Alessandro finally opened his eyes 3 days later, the first thing he saw was Annika reviewing his charts at his bedside. She had just finished a 20-hour shift, but had stopped by to check on him one last time before heading home. His voice had been weak, barely a whisper, but his words would echo in her memory forever. "Are you an angel?" he had asked, his Italian accent thick with medication and fatigue. Annika had laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the sterile hospital room. "No, Mr. Roberts, just your surgeon." "Even better," he had replied, managing a weak smile. "Angels are overrated." What followed was a romance that set Boston's social circles ablaze with gossip. The wealthy white pharmaceutical CEO pursuing a relationship with the black doctor who saved his life seemed like something out of a movie. The tabloids had been merciless, suggesting everything from gold digging to publicity stunts. But Alessandro had never cared about the whispers, the raised eyebrows, or the not-so-subtle suggestions from his board members that the relationship might impact stock prices. He had pursued her with a single-minded determination that both flattered and amused her. "They're just jealous," he would say, pulling her close as they walked past the disapproving stares at charity galas. "They see what I see. The most brilliant, beautiful woman in Boston." Their courtship had been a whirlwind of impromptu trips to Italy, midnight surgery observations. Alessandro had insisted on watching her work, fascinated by her skill, and long conversations about their dreams for the future. He spoke of revolutionizing pharmaceutical research, of making life-saving drugs more accessible. She shared her hopes of expanding trauma care in underserved communities. The proposal came 6 months after his discharge from the hospital. Alessandro had arranged for the hospital board to name the new trauma center after her, supposedly in recognition of her groundbreaking work. When she arrived for the dedication ceremony, she found the building's lobby transformed into a garden of her favorite flowers, purple orchids and white roses. "You saved my life," Alessandro had said, dropping to one knee before Boston's medical elite. "Now I'm asking you to share it with me." The wedding was a grand affair, blending Italian luxury with African traditions. Annika's parents, both prominent civil rights attorneys from Atlanta, had initially been wary of the whirlwind romance. But Alessandro's genuine love for their daughter and his respect for their family's heritage had won them over. Now, 3 years later, Annika stood in their bathroom holding the proof of their love growing inside her. She had suspected for a few weeks the subtle changes in her body, the sudden aversion to the coffee she usually craved, the fatigue that seemed bone-deep despite her usual stamina. As a doctor, she had recognized the signs, but had waited until she was certain before taking the test. Alessandro had been dropping hints about starting a family for months. He would point out children in the park, suggest names casually over dinner, leave baby boutique catalogues open on her desk. His desire for a child had become almost palpable, making this moment even more precious. The irony wasn't lost on her that today was also the day of his big meeting with the new pharmaceutical representative from Cook Industries. He had been preoccupied with this meeting for weeks, talking about potential partnerships and market expansions. Annika smiled, knowing her news would overshadow any business deal. She had already planned how she would tell him. A private dinner at l'Espalier, where they had their first date. She would wear the red dress he loved, the one he said made her look like a queen. The pregnancy test and a pair of tiny baby shoes would be wrapped in a gift box, waiting for the perfect moment. Annika's phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. A trauma was coming in, multiple casualties from a pile-up on the Mass Pike. With practiced efficiency, she tucked the test into her purse and transformed back into Dr. Roberts, pushing her personal joy aside to focus on saving lives. As she drove to the hospital, one hand unconsciously drifted to her still flat stomach. Soon, she would share this secret with Alessandro, and their perfect life would be even more complete. They would be a family, her, Alessandro, and their child, a beautiful blend of their two worlds. If only she had known that at that very moment, Alessandro was sitting in his office, his hand resting on Calliope Cook's lower back as they reviewed contracts. If only she had seen the way the blonde pharmaceutical representative leaned too close, smiled too warmly, touched too familiarly. But Annika didn't see any of that. She saw only the future she imagined, a future that would shatter like glass in the coming months, cutting deep enough to draw blood. The same blood that Alessandro would later ask her to give, not knowing he was asking her to choose between his mistress and their unborn child. For now, though, Annika Rose Roberts was simply a woman in love, carrying the most precious secret of her life. The morning sun continued to stream through the bathroom window, blessing a moment of perfect happiness before the storm that was coming. Sometimes the most beautiful moments in life are the ones right before everything falls apart, when we still believe in perfect love and happy endings. Little did she know that this moment of joy would become a bitter-sweet memory, one she would look back on years later as the last time she truly believed in fairy tales. But perhaps that was the greatest gift of all, for when the fairy tale ended, She would discover something far more valuable than a perfect love story. She would discover her own power, her own strength, and her own ability to turn betrayal into triumph. As she pulled into the hospital parking lot, Annika took one last moment to touch her stomach and whisper a promise to her unborn child. "You and me, little one. We're going to be amazing together." She didn't know then how prophetic those words would be, or how this child would become both her anchor and her wings in the storms ahead. But that was a story for another day. For now, she was simply a woman carrying a precious secret, about to start another day of saving lives, unaware that her own life was about to need saving. Chapter 2. The Other Woman. Calliope Cook's Louboutin heels clicked against the polished marble floors of Roberts Pharmaceuticals headquarters with the precision of a metronome. Each step was calculated, just like every other move she had made in her 32 years of life. Her golden hair cascaded in perfect waves past her shoulders, and her Chanel suit was tailored to showcase both professionalism and allure. Another calculated choice. The security guard at the desk did a double-take as she approached, her red-soled heels continuing their rhythmic announcement of her arrival. "Ms. Cook, Mr. Roberts is expecting you." Of course he was. Calliope had spent 3 months orchestrating this meeting, leveraging every connection she had made during her meteoric rise through Cook Industries' ranks. As their top pharmaceutical representative, she had earned this opportunity to pitch a partnership with Roberts Pharmaceuticals. But Calliope had greater ambitions than mere business deals. The elevator ride to the top floor gave her time to review her mental notes. She knew everything about Alessandro Roberts, his business history, his philanthropic endeavors, his troubled relationship with his conservative board of directors, and most importantly, his marriage to Dr. Annika Rose Roberts, the brilliant trauma surgeon who had saved his life 3 years ago. Their love story had made headlines, the stuff of modern fairy tales. But Calliope didn't believe in fairy tales. She believed in opportunity, strategy, and the inevitable boredom that plagued powerful men who married their saviors. Alessandro's office door opened before she could knock. He stood there, tall and imposing in a perfectly tailored Italian suit, his dark hair slightly graying at the temples in a way that only enhanced his appeal. His eyes widened slightly as they met hers, the first genuine reaction she had seen from him in all her research. "Ms. Cook," he said, extending his hand, "welcome to Roberts Pharmaceuticals." His grip was firm, confident, but she noticed how his fingers lingered a fraction too long against hers. First crack in the armor, she thought, suppressing a smile. "Mr. Roberts," she replied, her voice a carefully modulated blend of honey and whiskey. "Thank you for making time in your busy schedule." The office was exactly as she had imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston's skyline, modern art pieces that probably cost more than most people's homes, and a massive desk that screamed power and success. But it was the small details that interested her more. The absence of personal photos, the slight disorder of papers on his desk, the empty coffee cups suggesting long, lonely nights at work. "Please sit," Alessandro gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "I've reviewed your proposal. It's intriguing." Calliope settled into the chair, crossing her legs slowly enough to draw his eye, but quickly enough to maintain propriety. "Intriguing enough to discuss over dinner?" The question hung in the air between them. Both knew she had just crossed a line, had taken their meeting from professional to something more dangerous. Alessandro's hand twitched slightly as he reached for her proposal. "Ms. Cook." "Calliope, please," she interrupted, her smile disarming. "And before you remind me that you're married, let me be clear, I'm proposing a business dinner. Nothing more, nothing less, unless, of course, you'd like it to be something more." Alessandro's jaw tightened, but she saw the flash of interest in his eyes. A business dinner would be appropriate. My secretary can arrange. I prefer to handle my own arrangements, she said, sliding a business card across his desk. There's a small Italian place in the North End, Giacomo's. Tonight at 8? She stood, smoothing her skirt. Unless you need to check with your wife first? The challenge in her voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Alessandro picked up her card, his wedding ring catching the light. 8 o'clock is fine. That first dinner led to another, then another. Business meetings stretched into late-night discussions about life, ambition, and the weight of expectations. Calliope played her role perfectly, the ambitious young executive who understood the pressures of his world, who didn't demand emotional vulnerability or constant attention. While Annika worked her long hospital shifts, Calliope became Alessandro's confidant. She listened to his frustrations about the board's resistance to new research directions, offered insights into market trends, and always made him feel understood. Their first kiss happened 6 weeks after their initial meeting in his office late one night. She had been reviewing quarterly projections, her perfume filling the space between them with promise and temptation. When Alessandro finally gave in, pulling her into his arms, Calliope felt the thrill of victory, even as she returned his kiss with carefully crafted passion. The affair progressed like a chess game, each move planned and executed with precision. Private dinners became weekend meetings at discreet hotels. Calliope never pushed, never demanded, never made Alessandro feel guilty. She was simply there, available and understanding, a sharp contrast to Annika's increasingly busy schedule. What Alessandro didn't know was that every moment was documented, every text message saved, every hotel receipt carefully filed away. Calliope hadn't worked her way up from nothing to settle for being just another mistress. She had bigger plans, and Alessandro Roberts was just a piece in her larger game. The partnership between Roberts Pharmaceuticals and Cook Industries progressed alongside their affair. Board members noted Alessandro's enthusiasm for the collaboration, attributing it to the obvious business benefits rather than the blonde representative who now attended all major meetings. Calliope watched with satisfaction as Alessandro became increasingly dependent on her presence. She memorized his habits, his preferences, the ways to soothe his ego when board meetings turned contentious. She became indispensable both in and out of the boardroom, but she hadn't counted on one thing: the genuine feelings that began to creep into her calculated plan. Despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance, there were moments when Alessandro's vulnerability touched something real inside her. The way he would trace patterns on her bare shoulder after their encounters, speaking softly about his dreams and fears. The genuine pride in his voice when she offered innovative solutions to company challenges. These unexpected emotions made her angry, made her push harder against the boundaries of their arrangement. She began to resent Annika not just as an obstacle to her ambitions, but as the woman who still held Alessandro's heart. The fairy tale romance that had once seemed like a convenient weakness to exploit now felt like a personal affront. Late one night, as they lay in the shadows of an expensive hotel room, Calliope finally played her riskiest card. "I'm not feeling well," she whispered, letting vulnerability creep into her voice. "The doctors. They say I need a transfusion, something about rare antibodies in my blood." Alessandro's body tensed beside her. "A transfusion?" "They're having trouble finding a match," she continued, her voice trembling perfectly. "I'm scared, Alessandro." She felt his arms tighten around her, felt the conflict radiating through his body. She had done her research thoroughly. She knew Annika's blood type, knew it would match her own. It was the ultimate test of Alessandro's devotion, asking him to choose between his mistress's health and his wife's principles. What Calliope didn't know was that Annika was pregnant, that her request would force Alessandro to risk not only his marriage, but his unborn child. She didn't know that this calculated move would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy everything she had worked for. As Alessandro held her that night, promising to find a way to help, Calliope allowed herself a small smile of triumph. She had him exactly where she wanted him, or so she thought. But fate has a way of unraveling even the most carefully woven plans, and Calliope Cook was about to learn that some games have consequences beyond even her careful calculations. The city lights twinkled beyond the hotel window, casting shadows that danced across the walls like omens. In the darkness, two people lay entwined, one driven by calculated ambition masquerading as love, the other by a weakness he would soon come to regret with every fibre of his being. And somewhere across the city, in a hospital operating room, Annika Roberts continued saving lives, unaware that her own perfect world was about to shatter. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the real game was about to begin. Calliope had orchestrated everything perfectly, but she would soon learn that even the most perfect plans can't account for the wild card of true love, or the vengeful fury of a woman betrayed. Chapter 3. A Cruel Request. The evening light cast long shadows across the Roberts' kitchen as Annika stirred a pot of her grandmother's gumbo, the rich aroma filling the air with memories of home. She had been craving southern comfort food lately, one of the many changes her pregnancy had brought. At 12 weeks, her secret was getting harder to keep, but she had wanted to wait for the perfect moment to tell Alessandro. The sound of his key in the door made her heart skip. Tonight would be that moment. She had even bought a bottle of his favorite non-alcoholic Italian wine to celebrate, knowing she wouldn't be able to share his usual Brunello. But when Alessandro stepped into the kitchen, the hollow look in his eyes made her pause, wooden spoon suspended mid-stir. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. He looked exhausted, his typically immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. His tie was loosened, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands, those strong, steady hands she loved, wouldn't stop fidgeting with his wedding ring. Annika turned off the stove, medical instincts kicking in as she assessed his appearance. "What's wrong? Did something happen at work?" She moved to embrace him, but he stepped back, maintaining a distance that felt like a physical blow. "It's about Calliope," he said, and something in his tone made Annika's blood run cold. She had met the pharmaceutical representative several times at company functions, had noticed the woman's perfectly calculated smiles and the way her eyes followed Alessandro. But surely, "She needs a blood transfusion," Alessandro continued, each word seeming to cost him physical effort. "She has a rare blood type, and the doctors are having trouble finding a match." Annika's medical mind immediately engaged, professional instincts temporarily overriding personal concerns. "What's her blood type? I can check with the hospital's blood bank, maybe reach out to other facilities." "You're a match," Alessandro interrupted, and the kitchen suddenly felt airless. "Your blood type. It's compatible with hers." Time seemed to stop as the implications of his words sank in. The wooden spoon clattered to the floor, sending drops of gumbo spattering across the pristine tiles like drops of blood. "How do you know my blood type matches hers?" The silence that followed was deafening. Annika watched her husband's face, praying for an explanation that wouldn't destroy everything she believed about their marriage. But Alessandro's guilty expression told her everything she needed to know. "You accessed my medical records." It wasn't a question. As chief of surgery, Annika knew exactly how private medical information was protected, knew the ethical and legal boundaries Alessandro had crossed. "You violated HIPAA regulations, violated my privacy, all for her." Alessandro ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had once found endearing. Now, it just made her sick. I had to know if you could help. She's very ill, Annika. The antibodies in her blood don't. Annika's voice cut through his explanation like a scalpel. Don't you dare try to explain the medical aspects to me. I'm a doctor, Alessandro. I understand blood types and antibodies far better than you ever will. She pressed her hands against the cool granite countertop, trying to steady herself as the room seemed to spin. What I don't understand is why you had access to my medical information in the first place. The answer hit her before he could respond. Roberts Pharmaceuticals had recently acquired a stake in several private hospitals, including the one where she had her regular checkups. As CEO, Alessandro would have had the authority to access patient records under the guise of administrative oversight. How long? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. How long have you been seeing her? Alessandro's silence was answer enough. Annika's mind raced through the past few months, the late meetings, the business trips, the subtle changes in his behavior. All the signs she had ignored, too busy saving other people's lives to notice her own life crumbling. Please, Alessandro finally spoke, his voice breaking. Just hear me out. Calliope's condition is serious. The transfusion could save her life. You're a doctor. You took an oath to help people. Don't you dare invoke my oath, Annika snapped, fury rising like bile in her throat. That oath doesn't obligate me to give my blood to my husband's mistress, and you have no right to ask, no right to even know my blood type without my consent. She pressed a hand to her still flat stomach, the gesture unconscious but not unnoticed by Alessandro. His eyes widened slightly, a question forming on his lips, but Annika couldn't bear to hear it. Not now. Not like this. There are proper channels for blood donation, she continued, her professional tone at odds with the trembling of her hands. If Calliope needs blood, she can work with the hospital's blood bank. They have protocols for rare blood types, networks they can access. They've tried all that, Alessandro interrupted. Your blood type is rare, especially with your specific antibody profile. You could help her, Annika. You could save her life, just like you saved mine. The comparison struck her like a physical blow. Is that what this is about? You think because I saved your life, I'm obligated to save hers too? That my blood is somehow yours to offer? Of course not. Alessandro reached for her, but Annika stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. I'm just asking you to consider it, to help someone in need. Someone in need, Annika repeated, bitter laughter bubbling up in her throat. Someone who's been sleeping with my husband, someone you violated my privacy for. She shook her head, tears threatening to fall. How did you even explain having access to my medical information? Did you tell her about going through my records? Or did you make up some story about me offering to help? Alessandro's silence was damning. Annika could picture it. Him and Calliope, probably lying in some hotel bed discussing her blood type like it was their secret to share. The violation felt complete, absolute. Get out, she whispered, then louder when he didn't move. Get out! Annika, please. I said get out. She grabbed the nearest object, a crystal wine glass they had brought back from their honeymoon in Italy, and hurled it against the wall. The sound of shattering glass was oddly satisfying, the scattered pieces catching the evening light like diamonds. Alessandro backed away, hands raised in surrender. I'll give you space, but please think about it. She really does need help. After he left, Annika sank to the kitchen floor, heedless of the spilled gumbo and scattered glass. Her grandmother's recipe, meant to be part of a joyous celebration, now filled the air with the bitterness of betrayal. She pressed both hands against her stomach, feeling the slight swell that only she knew was there. I'm so sorry, little one, she whispered to her unborn child. I'm so sorry you have to witness this. The irony wasn't lost on her, that Alessandro was asking her to risk their baby's health for his mistress, not knowing he was choosing between his lover and his own child. The doctor in her knew that blood donation during pregnancy carried risks, however small. The woman in her knew that even if she weren't pregnant, the request would still be an unforgivable violation. As the sun set outside their Beacon Hill mansion, casting the kitchen in deepening shadows, Annika Rose Roberts made a decision. She would not give her blood to save Calliope Cook. She would not risk her baby's health for the woman who had helped destroy her marriage, and she would never ever forgive Alessandro for putting her in this position. Rising from the floor with the grace and determination that had carried her through countless surgeries, Annika began to plan. She had saved Alessandro's life once, had given him her heart, her trust, and her future. But she wouldn't give him anything more, not her blood, not her forgiveness, and certainly not the power to hurt her again. Tomorrow she would call her lawyer. Tomorrow she would begin the process of untangling her life from Alessandro's web of betrayal. Tomorrow she would start building a new future for herself and her child. But tonight she would allow herself to grieve for the fairy tale that had turned into a nightmare. The gumbo grew cold on the stove, forgotten like the dreams of a happy announcement and a joyous celebration. Outside, Boston's lights twinkled indifferently, while inside the massive house a woman's heart hardened into steel, forged in the fire of betrayal. Alessandro had asked for her blood, but he would get something else entirely. A lesson in consequences, in the power of a woman scorned, and in the fierce protection of a mother-to-be. He had forgotten that the same hands that could heal could also destroy, that the same woman who had saved his life could also bring his world crashing down. As Annika finally climbed the stairs to their bedroom, soon to be just her bedroom, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. Her eyes were dry now, her spine straight, her chin lifted in defiance. She looked like a warrior preparing for battle, and in many ways, she was. The blood he wanted would stay in her veins, nourishing the new life growing within her. And if Alessandro Roberts thought this request was cruel, he had no idea what was coming, because Annika Rose Roberts had not survived years of medical school, residency, and countless life-or-death situations to be broken by a man's betrayal. She was a healer by profession, but now she would learn to be something else, a survivor, a fighter, and eventually an avenger. The next chapters of her life would be written in her own hand, in ink as red as the blood he had dared to ask for, and as permanent as the scars his betrayal had left on her heart. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. The morning sun hadn't yet risen over Boston when Annika made her decision. She had spent the night in her home office, surrounded by medical journals and pregnancy research, building her case like she would prepare for a complicated surgery. The facts were clear, the risks documented, the choice inevitable. Alessandro found her there, still in yesterday's clothes, her laptop screen glowing with statistics about blood donation during pregnancy. He carried 2 cups of coffee, a peace offering that made her want to scream. Did he not remember that she hadn't touched coffee in weeks? "You've been up all night," he said softly, setting 1 cup down beside her. The familiar scent that once brought comfort now turned her stomach. Or maybe that was just the morning sickness. "I'm pregnant," Annika whispered, watching his face pale in the blue light of her laptop screen. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications he hadn't yet grasped. "And you want me to risk my baby's health for your mistress?" Alessandro stumbled backward as if physically struck, coffee sloshing over the rim of his cup onto the expensive carpet. Under different circumstances, he would have cursed about the stain. Now he just stared at her, his mouth opening and closing without sound. How long have you known?" he finally managed, his Italian accent thickening with emotion. 12 weeks, Annika replied, her voice gaining strength. I was going to tell you over a romantic dinner. I had it all planned, the announcement, the celebration, the joy of sharing our miracle. She laughed bitterly. Instead, I get to tell you like this while discussing blood donations for your lover. Alessandro set his coffee cup down with shaking hands. The baby, is it okay? Are you both healthy? Don't. Annika held up a hand, stopping his concerned father act. Don't pretend to care about our child's health while asking me to risk it for Calliope. I didn't know, he protested, running his hands through his disheveled hair. If I had known about the pregnancy. You would what? Annika cut him off, rising from her chair with the fluid grace she maintained even in fury. You would have waited to ask, found someone else to violate HIPAA regulations for, or maybe you would have ended things with her? The slight flinch at her last question told her everything. You're not going to end it, are you? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Even now, knowing about our baby, you're still choosing her. It's not that simple, Alessandro pleaded. Calliope needs the baby. Annika's voice rose, filling the office with her pain and rage. You mean your child, your flesh and blood, the heir to Robert's pharmaceuticals that you've been wanting for 3 years, and you'd risk its life for her? She pulled up a medical journal article on her laptop, turning the screen toward him. Blood donation during pregnancy can lead to complications. The reduced blood volume can affect fetal development, increase the risk of preterm labor, compromise placental function. Her doctor's voice took over, clinical and precise. These risks are small but real. Are you willing to gamble with your child's health? Alessandro paced the office, his expensive shoes wearing a path in the carpet. The doctors say it would be a small donation, carefully monitored. The baby would be fine. The doctors? Annika's eyebrows shot up. You've already discussed this with doctors? Without consulting me? Without telling them I'm pregnant? She shook her head in disbelief. How many more medical ethics violations are you planning to commit for her? I was trying to help. Alessandro's voice rose to match hers. Calliope's condition. Say her name again, Annika dared him, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Say your mistress's name one more time, in the same breath as our unborn child. I dare you. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, Boston was beginning to wake up, the first rays of sunlight painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Inside, a marriage was dying in the harsh light of truth. How long? Annika asked again, needing to know even though the answer would destroy her. How long have you been sleeping with her? Alessandro's shoulders slumped. 3 months. The timeline hit Annika like a physical blow. 3 months. Almost exactly when she had conceived their child. While new life was taking root in her womb, her husband had been planting the seeds of their marriage's destruction. Did you love me at all? The question escaped before she could stop it, vulnerability bleeding through her anger. Or was I just the black doctor who saved your life, made you look progressive to your board members? Of course I loved you. Alessandro moved toward her but stopped when she backed away. I still love you. This thing with Calliope, it just happened. I never meant... It just happened. Annika's laugh was sharp enough to cut. Nothing just happens to Alessandro Roberts. You plan everything, calculate every move. Just like you calculated going through my medical records, like you calculated asking for my blood without telling me about the affair. She moved to the window, watching the city come alive below. From this height, everything looked small, manageable, but up close her world was shattering into pieces too sharp to hold. I wanted to tell you about the pregnancy over dinner at L'Espalier, she said softly. I bought a pair of tiny Italian leather shoes, had them wrapped in silver paper. I thought, her voice caught, I thought you would be so happy. Alessandro made a sound of pain behind her. I am happy. A baby. Our baby. It's everything we wanted. No. Annika turned to face him, one hand protectively covering her stomach. This baby is everything I wanted. You wanted an heir, a continuation of the Roberts legacy. Well, congratulations, you'll have one. But you won't have me. What are you saying? I'm saying that I won't give Calliope my blood. I won't risk our child's health for your mistress. And I won't stay in this marriage. The words, once spoken, seemed to change the very air in the room. Alessandro staggered back, as if she had struck him. Annika, please, we can work through this. Couples therapy, time apart, whatever you need. What I need, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. What I need is a husband who doesn't violate my medical privacy. What I need is a father for my child who doesn't ask me to risk its health for his lover. What I need, her voice broke. What I need is the man I thought I married. But he never existed, did he? The sun had fully risen now, flooding the office with light that seemed too bright, too harsh for this moment. Annika gathered her laptop and research papers, moving with the deliberate calm that had served her through countless surgeries. I'll be staying at the Four Seasons until I find an apartment, she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce proceedings. Divorce? Alessandro looked lost, like a man watching his empire crumble. Annika, think about the baby. We should try to work this out, give our child a proper family. Our child will have a proper family, she replied, gathering her coat. A mother who protects them, who shows them what strength looks like, what self-respect means. She paused at the door. Better that than a father who treats blood ties as negotiable. As she walked out of the office, out of their home, out of the life they had built together, Annika felt something shift inside her. The fairy tale was over, shattered by betrayal and blood. But from its ashes something stronger was rising, a woman who would rewrite her own story, a mother who would move heaven and earth to protect her child. Behind her, Alessandro called her name, his voice breaking with desperation. But Annika didn't look back. She had given him her heart, her trust, and nearly her blood. She wouldn't give him her tears too. The morning air was crisp with possibility as she drove away from Beacon Hill, away from betrayal, toward a future she would build on her own terms. Her hand rested on her stomach, feeling the slight swell that held all her hopes and dreams. Just you and me now, little one, she whispered, and we're going to be extraordinary. The sun climbed higher in the Boston sky, casting long shadows behind her as she drove toward her new life. Sometimes the breaking point isn't an ending, it's a beginning, and Annika Rose Roberts was just beginning to discover her true strength. Chapter 5. Shattered Dreams. The divorce papers sat on Alessandro Roberts's mahogany desk like a death sentence, their crisp white pages stark against the dark wood. He had been staring at them for hours, the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage," burning into his retinas. The afternoon sun, slanting through his office windows, caught the edge of his wedding ring, still firmly in place on his left hand, mocking him with its golden promise of forever. He hadn't expected Annika to actually leave. In the 3 years of their marriage, she had always been the forgiving one, the one who understood his long hours, his business pressures, his occasional emotional distance. He had taken that forgiveness for granted, assumed it was as permanent as the surgical scar she had left on his chest when she saved his life. Now, sitting in his corner office 30 stories above Boston's financial district, Alessandro realized just how badly he had miscalculated. The papers before him were meticulous, prepared by one of the city's top divorce attorneys. Annika had clearly been planning this, gathering her resources like a general preparing for war. His phone buzzed. Another message from Calliope. She had been texting constantly since Annika's departure 3 days ago, alternating between concern for his emotional state and questions about the blood transfusion she still needed. Alessandro ignored it, just as he had ignored the last dozen messages. Instead, he picked up the photograph that usually sat facing away from him on his desk. It was from their honeymoon in Tuscany, Annika laughing in a sunflower field, her dark skin glowing in the Italian sun, her white sundress billowing in the breeze. She had never looked more beautiful, more alive, more his. "Mr. Roberts?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board members are waiting in the conference room for the emergency meeting." Of course they were. News of his impending divorce had spread through Boston's business circles like wildfire. Roberts' pharmaceuticals stock had already dropped 3 points since the rumors began. His conservative board members, who had barely tolerated his marriage to Annika in the first place, would be circling like sharks, scenting blood. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes, he replied, straightening his tie and trying to compose himself. As he gathered his papers, his eyes fell on the small velvet box hidden behind his laptop. Inside was a pair of tiny Italian leather baby shoes. He had found them in Annika's home office after she left, still wrapped in silver paper. The gift she had never gotten to give him, the announcement that should have been a moment of joy, not a weapon in their final battle. The walk to the conference room felt like a funeral march. Employees averted their eyes as he passed, their whispered conversations falling silent. Everyone knew. In a company this size, secrets had a way of spreading, especially when they involved the CEO's personal life. Alessandro, Edward Montgomery, the head of the board, greeted him with barely concealed disdain. "We need to discuss the situation." The situation. As if his imploding marriage could be reduced to a corporate euphemism. Alessandro took his seat at the head of the table, noting the empty chair where Calliope usually sat during these meetings. She had wisely chosen to work from home today. "The board has concerns," Montgomery continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The publicity surrounding your domestic issues could have serious implications for our upcoming FDA approvals, not to mention the potential legal exposure from the alleged HIPAA violations." Alessandro's jaw clenched. Alleged violations, as if they didn't all know exactly what he had done, accessing Annika's medical records through their newly acquired hospital network. He had abused his position, violated her privacy, all for a woman who now wouldn't even show her face in the office. Furthermore, another board member chimed in, Dr. Roberts's position as Chief of Surgery at Mass General has been beneficial to our research partnerships. Her departure could complicate several ongoing clinical trials. They had always seen Annika as an asset, a convenient connection to the medical establishment. None of them had ever acknowledged her brilliant mind, her skilled hands, her compassionate heart. To them, she had been a useful tool, just as he had ultimately treated her. "I'll handle it," Alessandro said, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. "The divorce will be quiet, professional. Annika won't—" "Annika?" Montgomery's eyebrows rose. "Oh, you haven't heard. Dr. Roberts has already resigned her position at Mass General. She's accepted a position as Chief of Surgery at Johns Hopkins. The announcement went out this morning." The news hit Alessandro like a physical blow. Johns Hopkins, Baltimore. She wasn't just leaving him, she was leaving Boston entirely, taking their unborn child to another city, another life far from his reach. "She can't," he whispered, then realized he had spoken aloud when the board members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "She can, and she has," Montgomery stated flatly. "Which brings us to our next concern, the prenuptial agreement." "Leave it," Alessandro cut him off, rising from his chair. "All of you, just leave it." He strode out of the conference room, ignoring their protests, their concerns about stock prices and public relations. None of it mattered, not when Annika was slipping through his fingers like water, taking their future, their child, everything he hadn't known he needed until it was too late. Back in his office, Alessandro finally looked at Calliope's messages. Each one felt like another nail in the coffin of his marriage, another reminder of how he had destroyed everything for a woman he now realized he barely knew. His hand shook as he picked up his phone, scrolling to Annika's number. It went straight to voicemail, as it had every time he'd called since she left. Her voice, professional and detached, instructed him to contact her lawyer with any questions about the divorce proceedings. The sun was setting over Boston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded him of the blood he had dared to ask for, the sacrifice he had expected her to make. In the gathering darkness of his office, Alessandro Roberts finally understood the magnitude of what he had lost. He had asked for Annika's blood once before, when he lay dying on her operating table. She had given it then, along with her skill, her dedication, and eventually her heart. But he had gotten greedy, had asked for more, her privacy, her dignity, her trust. And now he was losing everything, watching his perfect life shatter like the wineglass she had thrown against their kitchen wall. The divorce papers still sat on his desk, waiting for his signature. Next to them, the tiny Italian baby shoes seemed to mock him with their promise of a future he would never see. His child would be born in Baltimore, would take its first steps in a city where he wasn't, would grow up knowing him only as the father who had betrayed its mother before it was even born. Alessandro picked up his pen, then put it down again. Signing the papers would make it real, would acknowledge that he had destroyed the best thing in his life for a woman who had seen him as a stepping stone to power. Calliope's blood type, her sudden need for a transfusion. Had any of it been real, or had it been another calculated move in her corporate chess game? The answers didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except the fact that Annika was gone, taking with her all the warmth, all the love, all the redemption she had brought into his life. She had saved him once with her skilled hands and determined heart, but there would be no saving him this time. As night fell over Boston, Alessandro Roberts sat alone in his dark office, surrounded by the wreckage of his perfect life. On his desk, the divorce papers waited patiently for his signature, while in his pocket, his phone buzzed with another message from the woman who had helped him destroy everything. Sometimes dreams don't shatter all at once. Sometimes they crack slowly, one small betrayal at a time, until suddenly you're standing in the ruins, wondering how you let it all fall apart. Alessandro had thought he was building an empire, never realizing he was dismantling his kingdom, stone by stone, betrayal by betrayal, until nothing remained but regret and the cold comfort of an empty office at night. Chapter 6. Awakening. The Baltimore morning air was different from Boston's, heavier, more humid, carrying the salt scent of the inner harbor instead of the Atlantic's crisp breeze. Annika Rose stood on the balcony of her new penthouse apartment, watching the sun rise over Johns Hopkins Hospital in the distance. At 16 weeks pregnant, her baby bump was just beginning to show beneath her silk robe, a gentle reminder of why she had chosen this new beginning. The transition to Johns Hopkins had been seamless, almost suspiciously so. The hospital board had practically tripped over themselves to welcome her, offering a compensation package that made her Boston salary look modest. They didn't mention the headlines about her divorce from Alessandro Roberts, or the rumors swirling through medical circles about why one of Boston's top surgeons had suddenly relocated. Dr. Roberts? Her new assistant's voice came through the intercom. Your first surgical consult is in 30 minutes. Thank you, James, she replied, already moving to her closet where her clothes hung in perfect order. All traces of her old life in Boston removed, replaced by a wardrobe that spoke of power rather than privilege. No more designer dresses chosen to complement Alessandro's Italian suits. Now she dressed for herself, in clothes that made her feel like the warrior she was becoming. The hospital corridors felt different too. At Mass General, she had been Alessandro Roberts' wife, who happened to be a brilliant surgeon. Here, she was simply Doctor. Annika Rose, Chief of Surgery, and her reputation preceded her. The whispers that followed her now were of admiration rather than gossip. "The patient in 701 needs emergency surgery," a resident reported as Annika strode into the surgical wing. "Multiple trauma from a car accident, similar to the case that made you famous in Boston. Similar to Alessandro's accident, the case that had brought him into her life, that had started this whole story." Annika's hand instinctively moved to her stomach, feeling the flutter of movement that had recently begun. Her child, reminding her that some good had come from that chapter of her life. "Let's save this one too," she said, heading to scrub in. In the operating room, Annika found her true awakening. Here, with a scalpel in her hand and a life in the balance, she was most herself. No one's wife, no one's victim, just a surgeon doing what she was born to do. The surgery was complex, the kind that would have once made headlines. Alessandro Roberts' wife performs miracle. Now it was just another day, another life saved by Dr. Rose's skilled hands. The rush of success, of knowing she had made a difference, felt purer without the shadow of her marriage coloring it. "Beautiful work, Dr. Rose," her new head of trauma said afterward. "We're lucky to have you." Lucky. The word echoed in her mind as she changed out of her scrubs. She had once thought herself lucky to have caught Alessandro's eye, to have been chosen by him. Now she understood that she had been the prize all along. Her skill, her intelligence, her determination. He had been lucky to have her, and he had thrown it all away. During her lunch break, Annika reviewed the latest research proposals for her department. Johns Hopkins had given her complete autonomy over the surgical program, along with a research budget that made her previous resources look paltry. She was using it to focus on trauma care in underserved communities, the work she had always wanted to do, but had scaled back to accommodate Alessandro's corporate interests. Her phone buzzed with another email from Alessandro's lawyer. She deleted it without reading it. The divorce proceedings were moving forward, her legal team handling everything. She had left nothing to chance, documented everything. His HIPAA violations, his affair, his attempt to pressure her into a medical procedure while pregnant, the prenup he had insisted on, thinking it protected him, now worked in her favor thanks to the infidelity clause her father had insisted on including. Dr. Rose. A nurse appeared at her office door. "There's a delivery for you." Another bouquet of purple orchids and white roses, Alessandro's signature apology flowers. They had been arriving weekly since she left Boston. Annika waved them away. "Donate them to the pediatric ward," she said, as she had every other time. The afternoon brought a meeting with the hospital board, where Annika presented her plans for a new trauma center focused on serving Baltimore's inner city. The same proposal she had once shared with Alessandro, watching his eyes glaze over as he calculated the profit margins. "Ambitious," the board chairman commented, "but your track record speaks for itself. You have our full support." Support. Another thing she had thought she needed from Alessandro. But here she was, building something greater than she had ever dreamed, and doing it entirely on her own terms. In the evening, Annika attended her prenatal appointment with a doctor she had thoroughly vetted, in a practice unconnected to any hospital system Alessandro might have influence over. Her baby was growing strong, unaffected by the stress of the past months. "Would you like to know the gender?" the doctor asked, smiling, as the ultrasound showed a clear image. "Yes," Annika replied firmly. This was her child, her future, and she would face it head-on, without fear or hesitation. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, and Annika felt tears spring to her eyes. A daughter. A little girl who would grow up knowing her mother's strength, who would never learn to make herself small for a man's ego. Back in her new apartment, Annika sat at her desk, reviewing surgical journals as the city lights twinkled below. Her laptop screen showed the latest stock prices for Robert's Pharmaceuticals, down another 5 points since her departure. She wasn't actively trying to hurt Alessandro's company, but she wasn't protecting it anymore either. The truth had a way of emerging when no one was working to hide it. A gentle kick from her daughter made her smile. "You're going to be a fighter too, aren't you?" she whispered, rubbing her growing bump. "Good. The world needs more women who know their worth." The night stretched out before her, quiet but not lonely. She had filled her life with purpose instead of regret, with ambition instead of anger. The woman who had left Boston in tears had awakened to her own power, had remembered who she was before Alessandro Roberts had made her his wife. Her phone buzzed again, Calliope Cook's name appearing on the screen. The woman had been trying to reach her since the news of the divorce broke, probably worried about what Annika might reveal about the blood-type manipulation, the carefully orchestrated affair. Annika blocked the number without hesitation. Let Calliope worry. Let her wonder when the other shoe would drop. As she prepared for bed, Annika caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Gone was the woman who had once trembled with joy over a positive pregnancy test, thinking her life was perfect. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had learned that the best fairy tales are the ones you write for yourself. The Baltimore night was warm, the city's lights creating a different constellation than the one she had known in Boston. But Annika Rose wasn't looking back anymore. She had thrown herself into her work, into her pregnancy, into building a legacy that had nothing to do with the Roberts name and everything to do with her own strength. Her awakening hadn't been gentle. It had come with pain, with betrayal, with the shattering of everything she had thought was true. But from those broken pieces, she had built something stronger, something entirely her own. And as she drifted off to sleep, her daughter, moving gently beneath her heart, Annika smiled. Sometimes the end of a fairy tale is just the beginning of a better story. Chapter 7. The birth. The contractions started during a complex thoracic surgery at Johns Hopkins. Annika Rose, now 8 months pregnant, had insisted on performing one last operation before starting her maternity leave. Her hands remained steady, even as her body signaled the beginning of labor, her focus unwavering as she completed the final sutures. "Doctor Rose," her assistant surgeon said cautiously, noticing the sheen of sweat on her forehead. "Are you—" "I'm fine," she cut him off, her voice carrying the authority that had made her legendary in 2 hospitals. "Close for me, doctor." Chen, textbook procedure. She made it to her office before doubling over with the next contraction, one hand braced against her desk while the other cradled her swollen belly. "Not yet, little one," she whispered. "We need to do this according to plan." The birth plan was meticulous, like everything else in Annika's new life. A private suite in Johns Hopkins maternity ward, staffed by doctors and nurses she had personally vetted. Security protocols that would make the Pentagon proud, designed to prevent any unwanted visitors, specifically one unwanted visitor. Her doctor, Sarah Martinez, was waiting when Annika arrived in the maternity ward, already changed into a hospital gown. 8 centimeters dilated, Dr. Martinez announced after examining her. "You've been in labor all day, haven't you?" Annika managed a small smile between contractions. "Had to finish my surgery first." "Only you would perform thoracic surgery while in active labor." Sarah shook her head, but her tone was admiring. Your little girl is definitely her mother's daughter, determined to do things her own way. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and purpose. Annika had declined an epidural, wanting to be fully present for her daughter's arrival. Each contraction brought her closer to meeting the little person who had been her strength through the darkest months of her life. "You don't have to do this alone," Sarah said softly during a brief respite between contractions. "We could call—" "No!" Annika's voice was firm despite her exhaustion. "He lost the right to be here when he chose her over us." The her didn't need explanation. Everyone in Baltimore's medical community knew the story of Alessandro Roberts and Calliope Cook, though few knew the full truth about the blood transfusion request that had been the final straw. As if summoned by the thought, Annika's phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "He's on his way. Private jet from Boston, landing in 30 minutes. Calliope, still trying to manipulate the situation, still inserting herself into Annika's life. The next contraction hit harder, fueled by anger and determination. "Increase security," Annika managed between breaths. "No one gets in without direct authorization from me." The hospital's security team, already on high alert, moved into position. They had been briefed extensively. Alessandro Roberts was not to set foot in the maternity ward, regardless of his wealth or influence. The final stage of labor came as the sun was setting over Baltimore, painting the hospital room in shades of gold and pink. Annika bore down with all her strength, channeling every ounce of pain and betrayal into bringing her daughter into the world. "One more push, Doctor," Martinez encouraged. "She's almost here." With a final primal effort, Annika felt her daughter slide into the world. The cry that filled the room was strong, indignant, a warrior's cry. Through tears of exhaustion and joy, she watched as her daughter was placed on her chest, perfect and beautiful, and completely untouched by the darkness that had preceded her birth. "Hello, Maya Rose," she whispered, counting tiny fingers and toes, memorizing every detail of her daughter's face. The name she had chosen carried power. Maya for her grandmother, who had taught her about strength. Rose for the middle name she would reclaim as her own, separating herself from the Roberts legacy. The peace of that first golden hour was shattered by commotion in the hallway. Alessandro's voice carried through the door, angry and desperate. "That's my child. I have a right to be here." Maya, startled by the noise, began to cry. Annika held her closer, protective instincts surging. "Get him out of here," she ordered, her voice carrying the same authority she used in the operating room. Through the door's window, she caught a glimpse of Alessandro being restrained by security. He looked disheveled, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. Their eyes met briefly, his pleading, hers unyielding. "Dr. Rose." The head of security appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Roberts is demanding to see the child. He's threatening legal action." "Let him," Annika replied, never taking her eyes off her daughter. "My lawyers are better than his." It was true. She had spent months preparing for this moment, working with the best family law attorneys in Maryland. Alessandro's name was not on the birth certificate, and his rights as a father were compromised by documented evidence of his attempts to endanger the pregnancy with his blood transfusion request. As security escorted Alessandro from the hospital, Annika heard Calliope's voice joining his protests. So she had come too, probably thinking her presence would somehow help. Instead, it only reinforced Annika's resolve. "Your father chose her over us once," she told Maya softly. "He doesn't get to change his mind now that you're here." The night deepened into quiet, broken only by the soft sounds of newborn breathing and the distant bustle of hospital activity. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, offering support, all of them fiercely protective of the chief of surgery and her newborn daughter. In the early hours of the morning, Annika received another text from Calliope. "He's destroyed without you both. The transfusion thing was my idea. Please don't punish him for my mistake." Annika deleted the message without responding. The time for explanations and excuses was long past. She had a daughter to protect now, a legacy to build that had nothing to do with the Roberts name or fortune. Maya Rose slept peacefully in her hospital bassinet, her perfect face relaxed in newborn dreams. She had her mother's warm brown skin and her father's straight nose, a blend of genetics that would make her striking as she grew. But more importantly, she would have her mother's strength, her determination, her unwavering sense of right and wrong. The sun rose over Baltimore, marking Maya's first morning in the world. In Boston, Roberts' pharmaceutical stock would open lower, the news of Alessandro's scene at the hospital already spreading through business circles. Calliope would be doing damage control, trying to salvage both the company's reputation and her position within it. But here in this quiet hospital room, none of that mattered. Annika Rose held her daughter, watching the dawn paint new colors across the sky. They had made it, through betrayal, through pain, through 9 months of growing stronger together. "Happy birthday, my love," she whispered to Maya. "Welcome to a world where women know their worth, where love doesn't require sacrifice, where strength comes from standing your ground." The security team remained posted outside her door, but they weren't really necessary anymore. Alessandro and Calliope had retreated to Boston, their dreams of forcing their way into Maya's life shattered against Annika's unshakable resolve. A nurse brought discharge papers for Annika to sign. The birth certificate listed only one parent, Annika Rose. No father's name, no hyphenated last name, no trace of the Roberts legacy. Maya would forge her own path, just as her mother had. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Annika caught her reflection in the window. She looked tired but triumphant, holding her daughter with the same steady hands that had saved countless lives. The woman in the glass wasn't a victim or a betrayed wife. She was a mother, a surgeon, a force of nature. The Baltimore morning was bright with promise as Annika carried Maya to the waiting car. Behind them, the hospital stood tall against the sky, a symbol of the new life they were building. Ahead lay a future full of possibilities, unmarred by the shadows of the past. Maya had been born into a storm, but she would grow up in the calm that follows, nurtured by a mother who had learned that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romance at all. They're about the fierce, unshakable bond between a mother and child, about the strength that comes from choosing yourself, about the power of writing your own happy ending. As the car pulled away from the hospital, Annika smiled down at her sleeping daughter. They had survived the birth, survived Alessandro's attempts to force his way back into their lives, survived the final desperate manipulations of the woman who had helped destroy a marriage. But more than survival, they had triumphed. Maya Rose would grow up knowing the truth about strength, about dignity, about standing firm in the face of betrayal. She would learn these lessons not from stories or lectures, but from watching her mother build an empire from the ashes of a broken fairy tale. The city stretched out before them, full of possibility. Somewhere in Boston, Alessandro Roberts was boarding his private jet for the flight home, defeat bitter on his tongue. Calliope Cook was probably already planning their next move, her calculating mind working overtime to salvage something from this failure, but they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the tiny girl sleeping peacefully in Annika's arms, the future they would build together, the legacy they would create that had nothing to do with the Roberts name and everything to do with the strength of women who refused to be broken. Maya Rose, born on a Baltimore morning, daughter of a warrior queen who had learned that sometimes the happiest endings come not from being chosen, but from choosing yourself. Her birth wasn't just the beginning of a life. It was the culmination of a revolution, the start of a new dynasty built on strength, dignity, and the unshakable bond between mother and daughter. Chapter 8. The Power Shift. The Johns Hopkins Medical Conference buzzed with anticipation as Dr. Annika Rose took the stage. 2 years had passed since Maya's birth, and in that time, Annika had transformed from Alessandro Roberts' ex-wife into one of the most influential figures in American medicine. Her keynote speech today would introduce a revolutionary surgical technique she had developed, one that would change the landscape of trauma care forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had become her trademark, "today we discuss not just saving lives, but transforming them." In the front row, 3-year-old Maya sat between Annika's parents, her dark curls framing a face that perfectly blended her mother's warmth and her father's classical features. She colored quietly in her medical-themed coloring book, already showing signs of following in her mother's footsteps. As Annika presented her findings, she couldn't help but notice the FDA representatives in the audience, their expressions intense as they took notes. They had been frequent visitors to her research department lately, especially since the questions about Roberts Pharmaceuticals' drug trials had begun to surface. Meanwhile, in Boston, Alessandro Roberts faced a very different kind of audience. The Roberts Pharmaceuticals boardroom had lost its warm mahogany glow, now feeling more like an interrogation chamber as shareholders demanded answers about the company's plummeting stock prices. "Mr. Roberts," Edward Montgomery's voice dripped with barely concealed disdain, "perhaps you could explain why 3 of our major research partnerships have withdrawn in the past month alone." Alessandro loosened his tie, feeling the pressure mounting. Calliope sat at the far end of the table, her golden hair now streaked with premature grey, her calculated smile replaced by a worried frown. She had maintained her position through the turbulent aftermath of their affair, but her influence had waned as the company's problems multiplied. "The partnerships are being reviewed," Alessandro replied, but his voice lacked its former authority. "We're implementing new protocols to address the FDA's concerns about our trial procedures." What he didn't say was that those concerns had originated from surprisingly well-informed anonymous tips that highlighted specific irregularities in trials that had been conducted during his marriage to Annika, when she had been quietly observing everything while playing the role of supportive wife. Back in Baltimore, Annika concluded her presentation to thunderous applause. The medical community had embraced her innovations, her dedication to ethical research, her focus on making advanced care accessible to underserved communities. She had built something far more valuable than the social position she had once held as Alessandro's wife. Dr. Rose, a young resident, approached her after the presentation. "Your work on trauma response protocols has revolutionized our emergency department. How do you balance it all, the research, the surgeries, being a single mother?" Annika smiled, watching Maya show her grandmother a particularly well-colored picture of the human heart. "I had to learn that balance comes from knowing your worth, not from compromising it." That evening, as Annika reviewed the day's surgical schedules in her office, her assistant brought in the latest financial reports about Roberts Pharmaceuticals. She had maintained discreet connections in Boston's business community, keeping tabs on her ex-husband's increasingly troubled company. The numbers told a story of decline: failed drug trials, withdrawn partnerships, whispered concerns about ethical violations. Each setback could be traced back to information that had somehow found its way to the right authorities at the right time. Information that only someone intimately familiar with the company's inner workings would have known. Her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer. "FDA officially launching full investigation into RP's trial procedures. Board meeting emergency session tomorrow." Annika set the phone down, allowing herself a small smile. During her marriage, she had been more than just Alessandro's wife. She had been a brilliant doctor with a keen eye for detail and a perfect memory. Every questionable decision, every ethical shortcut, every manipulated trial result had been noted and filed away in her mind. She hadn't actively sought revenge, but she hadn't protected them either. When certain irregularities had become apparent to her, she had simply ensured that the right people asked the right questions. The fact that those questions now threatened to bring down the mighty Roberts Pharmaceuticals was simply justice running its course. Across her office wall hung her growing collection of accolades, surgical innovation awards, research grants, humanitarian recognitions, each one earned solely on her merit, without the Roberts name lending its weight. Below them sat a photograph of Maya on her 3rd birthday, blowing out candles on a cake decorated with tiny surgical instruments. The contrast between her rising star and Alessandro's falling empire wasn't lost on the medical community. Whispers circulated about how he had lost not just a wife, but a moral compass, how Annika's departure had coincided with the beginning of the company's troubles. Calliope, too, was facing her own reckoning. Her carefully orchestrated rise through the corporate ranks had stalled as Roberts Pharmaceuticals' influence waned. The blood transfusion that had never been truly necessary had cost her far more than she had anticipated. As night fell over Baltimore, Annika drove home to her daughter, their penthouse apartment warm with the sounds of Maya's laughter as she played with her babysitter. The wall of windows offered a view of the city she had made her own, the hospital where she had built her legacy, rising proudly against the skyline. "Mommy!" Maya ran to her, clutching a drawing of what appeared to be a surgery in progress. "I made this for your office." Annika scooped her daughter up, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. This was her true success. Not the awards, not the innovations, not even the subtle dismantling of her ex-husband's empire. Her daughter was growing up strong, confident, unaware of the shadows that had preceded her birth. The next morning brought news that Alessandro had been called to testify before an FDA panel. The business channels buzzed with speculation about Roberts Pharmaceuticals' future, about the likelihood of criminal charges, about the sudden exodus of board members jumping ship. Annika watched the coverage while performing her morning rounds, feeling no triumph, no vindication, only a quiet certainty that the truth always finds its way to the surface. She hadn't needed to destroy Alessandro. He had done that himself with every ethical line he had crossed, every trust he had betrayed. Her day was filled with surgeries, each one a reminder of why she had chosen this path. In the operating room there was no room for betrayal, no place for manipulation. There was only the pure purpose of saving lives, of making a difference in the world. During her lunch break, she received another text from Boston. Calliope Cook had resigned from Roberts Pharmaceuticals, accepting a position with a smaller company far from the spotlight she had once craved. The woman who had helped destroy a marriage had finally reaped the consequences of her actions. The power shift was complete, but it had happened not through confrontation or revenge, but through the simple revelation of truth. Annika had risen by staying true to her principles, by focusing on her work and her daughter, by building rather than destroying. As she scrubbed in for her final surgery of the day, Annika caught her reflection in the surgical suite's window. The woman who looked back at her bore little resemblance to the one who had once stood trembling in a Boston bathroom, holding a positive pregnancy test and dreaming of a perfect life. This woman was stronger, wiser, more powerful in her own right than she had ever been as Alessandro Roberts' wife. She had transformed betrayal into strength, pain into purpose, a broken fairy tale into a story of triumph. The surgery went perfectly, as most of her procedures did these days. Afterward, as she wrote up her notes, news broke that Roberts Pharmaceuticals stock had hit an all-time low. The empire Alessandro had built, the legacy he had protected at the cost of his marriage, was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. But Annika was already focusing on tomorrow, on the research grant she would announce, on the new surgical wing she was designing, on the bedtime story she would read to Maya. She had learned that true power comes not from destroying others, but from building something meaningful of your own. As she drove home through the Baltimore evening, her phone lit up with a message from Alessandro's number. The first direct contact he had attempted in years. She deleted it without reading it, just as she had deleted every message since the day she had left Boston. The past had no power over her anymore. She had risen above it, built her own empire based on healing rather than harm, on truth rather than manipulation. The power shift wasn't just in their relative positions in the world. It was in the fundamental understanding that she had never needed his name, his influence, or his approval to be extraordinary. Maya was waiting at home, eager to share her day's adventures at preschool. As Annika listened to her daughter's stories, she felt the final pieces of her transformation fall into place. She hadn't just survived betrayal, she had alchemized it into gold, turning pain into power, loss into legacy. The city lights twinkled beyond their windows, a constellation of possibilities in the gathering dusk. Somewhere in Boston, Alessandro Roberts faced the ruins of his carefully constructed world. But here in Baltimore, Annika Rose held her daughter close, knowing that sometimes the greatest power lies not in what you take from others, but in what you build for yourself. Chapter 9. Calculated Moves. Annika sat in her home office in Baltimore, surrounded by files that told the story of Roberts Pharmaceuticals' downfall. Not the public story splashed across business newspapers, but the real story, the one she had pieced together during her years as Alessandro's wife. Every questionable trial, every manipulated result, every ethical shortcut had been carefully documented and stored away, like a surgeon collecting instruments for a complicated procedure. The chessboard on her desk, a gift from her father when she made chief of surgery, seemed particularly appropriate tonight. Each piece represented a different move in the game she had been playing since leaving Boston. Not for revenge, she told herself, but for justice. For every patient who had been given false hope by Roberts Pharmaceuticals' manipulated trial data, for every doctor who had prescribed their drugs, believing the company's claims. Her laptop pinged with a new email from her most reliable source inside Roberts Pharmaceuticals, a junior researcher who had once confided in her about data irregularities in their flagship drug trials. The email contained internal documents about their latest FDA submission, showing clearly manipulated efficacy rates. Annika's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she considered her next move. The FDA already had an open investigation into the company, but this new information would shift their focus to the current trials, not just historical ones. It would prove that the ethical violations weren't just in the past, that they continued even after her departure. "Mom?" Maya's voice came from the doorway. At 3.5, she was a perfect blend of her parents' features, but her spirit was all Annika. "Can you read me another story about the brave doctor?" Annika smiled, closing her laptop. The documents could wait. "Of course, sweetheart. How about the one where she saves the little girl's heart?" As she tucked Maya into bed, reading from their favorite book about pioneering female surgeons, Annika thought about the other reason for her calculated dismantling of Roberts Pharmaceuticals. Her daughter deserved to know that her mother had stood up to corruption, had chosen truth over comfort, justice over easy silence. The next morning, Annika made 2 calls before heading to the hospital. The first was to a journalist she trusted at the Wall Street Journal, sharing select details about the company's current trials. The second was to a member of Roberts Pharmaceuticals' board, one who had always been uncomfortable with Alessandro's methods, but had lacked the courage to speak up. "The FDA is expanding their investigation," she said simply. "You might want to distance yourself before the new findings become public." In her office at Johns Hopkins, Annika reviewed surgical schedules while monitoring the fallout. By noon, 2 board members had resigned, citing personal reasons. By 2, Roberts Pharmaceuticals stock had dropped another 12 points. By 4, the FDA had announced a deeper probe into their current drug trials. Her phone buzzed with a text from Calliope. "I know what you're doing. We should talk." Annika deleted the message without responding. Calliope had made her choice 3 years ago, had chosen ambition over ethics, manipulation over truth. Let her worry now as the carefully constructed house of cards began to fall. A knock at her office door interrupted her thoughts. "Dr. Rose? There's a representative from the FDA here to see you." The agent was young but sharp-eyed, carrying a thick folder of documents. "Dr. Rose, we've received some concerning information about Roberts Pharmaceuticals' trial procedures during your time there. Given your unique position as both a medical professional and the former wife of the CEO, I'll tell you everything I know," Annika replied, pulling out her own files. "Every trial I questioned, every data point that didn't add up, every patient whose results were conveniently excluded from the final reports." The interview lasted hours, her perfect memory providing dates, names, specific instances of ethical violations. She had spent years in operating rooms, learning to notice details others might miss, to remember every step of complicated procedures. Those same skills had made her an inadvertent witness to her ex-husband's corporate misconduct. As the FDA agent left, promising to be in touch, Annika felt no triumph, only a sense of relief. The truth she had carried for so long was finally finding its way into the light. That evening, as she drove home to Maya, news broke about a major pension fund divesting from Roberts Pharmaceuticals. The company's stock fell another 8 points in after-hours trading. Alessandro would be scrambling now, trying to contain the damage, probably never suspecting that his biggest threat came not from regulators or journalists, but from the woman he had betrayed. Maya was waiting with a new drawing, a careful child's rendition of a doctor performing surgery. "Is this you, sweetheart?" Annika asked, noting the dark-skinned figure, wearing surgical scrubs. "No, it's me when I grow up," Maya replied proudly. "I'm going to save people like you do, Mommy." Annika hugged her daughter close, breathing in her sweet scent. This was why she had chosen to act now, to bring the truth to light. Maya deserved to inherit a medical world built on integrity, not profit at any cost. Later that night, after Maya was asleep, Annika received another call from Boston. This time it was from Edward Montgomery, the board chairman who had never approved of her marriage to Alessandro. "You've won," he said without preamble. "The board is calling for Alessandro's resignation. We're preparing to cooperate fully with the FDA investigation." "This isn't about winning," Annika replied calmly. "It's about truth, about consequences, about doing what's right, even when it's difficult." After hanging up, she moved her white queen on the chessboard, capturing the black king. The game had never been about revenge. It had been about justice, about protecting future patients, about showing her daughter that sometimes the most powerful moves are the ones made quietly, with precision and purpose. Alessandro would realize soon enough that his empire hadn't been destroyed by external forces, but by the very woman he had underestimated, the one whose blood he had dared to treat as a commodity. The same surgical precision that had once saved his life had now been turned to excising the corruption from his company. As Baltimore's lights twinkled outside her window, Annika Rose allowed herself a small smile. She had made her moves carefully, calculated each step like planning a complex surgery, and like every operation she performed, this one had been about healing. Not just individual patients, but the entire system that was supposed to serve them. The next morning, would bring more revelations, more consequences, more pieces falling into place. But for now, Annika sat in her quiet home office, surrounded by the evidence of her careful strategy, knowing that sometimes the most effective moves are the ones your opponent never sees coming. She hadn't needed to raise her voice or make dramatic gestures. Like any good surgeon, she had simply cut away the diseased tissue precisely and methodically until only truth remained. Chapter 10. The Fall. The morning Alessandro Roberts' world finally crumbled began like any other. His driver had pulled up to Roberts Pharmaceuticals' gleaming headquarters at precisely 7 a.m., navigating through a growing crowd of reporters that Alessandro dismissed as routine business press. It wasn't until he saw the FBI vehicles parked in his reserved space that he understood this was the day he had always feared but never truly expected. The headlines scrolling across every screen in the lobby hit him like a physical blow. Breaking: Roberts Pharmaceuticals drug trials revealed as fraudulent. CEO faces criminal charges. Behind him, the revolving doors kept spinning, bringing in more federal agents, more reporters, more proof that his carefully constructed world was ending. Mr. Roberts. Edward Montgomery's voice cut through the chaos. The board chairman stood flanked by stern-faced lawyers and FBI agents. The board has convened an emergency session. Your presence is required. The journey to the boardroom felt like a funeral march. Employees he'd known for years turned away, some openly crying as they cleared out their desks. The stock price ticker in the lobby told the story in brutal red numbers, down 60% and still falling, decades of his family's legacy evaporating in real time. The evidence is insurmountable, Montgomery stated once they were seated in the boardroom. The familiar mahogany table now felt like an execution block. Falsified trial data going back 5 years, deliberately concealed negative results, patient deaths that were conveniently omitted from FDA submissions. Alessandro's throat went dry as the board's lead counsel projected documents onto the screen, internal emails, altered lab reports, manipulated statistical analyses. But what caught his eye was the metadata. Many of these files had been accessed during his marriage to Annika. She had seen everything, documented everything, waited patiently for the perfect moment to let the truth emerge. Furthermore, Montgomery continued, his voice dripping with disgust, we have evidence of attempts to obstruct justice. Your recent inquiries about the company's assets in Italy suggest plans to flee prosecution. The handcuffs felt cold against Alessandro's wrists as the FBI agents read him his rights. Through the boardroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see news helicopters circling, broadcasting his downfall to the world. Somewhere in Baltimore, was Annika watching? Was she shielding their daughter from seeing her father's disgrace? The perp walk through his own lobby was orchestrated for maximum media impact. Photographers who had once captured him at charity galas now documented his shame. His Italian suit, usually immaculate, was wrinkled from the rough handling of his arrest. The designers would probably ask him to stop wearing their brand after this. Mr. Roberts, did you knowingly approve falsified drug trials? How many patients died because of your fraud? Were you planning to flee the country? Does your ex-wife's testimony factor into the investigation? The reporter's questions followed him to the waiting FBI vehicle. Only the last one made him flinch. Annika, of course she wouldn't need to testify. She had built the perfect trap simply by preserving the truth he had tried so hard to bury. The federal courthouse was packed for his arraignment. He recognized faces in the crowd, former board members who had turned state's evidence, researchers who had finally spoken up about being pressured to alter data, doctors whose patients had suffered from his company's fraudulent drugs. But it was the empty spaces that spoke loudest. Calliope's absence, his mother's empty seat, the gulf where Annika would have once stood by his side. The prosecutor laid out the charges with devastating precision. Multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, violations of FDA regulations, endangering public health. Each count was supported by evidence so meticulously gathered it could only have been assembled over years. His own emails, his signatures on falsified reports, his instructions to subordinates, all preserved and presented with surgical accuracy. "Your Honor," his court-appointed lawyer argued weakly, "Mr. Roberts has deep ties to the community. His grandfather founded Roberts Pharmaceuticals. He's a prominent philanthropist." "Who used his position to perpetrate a massive fraud that endangered countless lives?" the prosecutor interrupted. "And we have evidence that the defendant has been liquidating assets and making inquiries about countries without extradition treaties." The judge's decision was swift. No bail. Alessandro Roberts, who had once ruled over a pharmaceutical empire, was remanded to federal custody. The same hands that had once signed multi-million-dollar deals were now being fingerprinted, their manicured nails stained with harsh black ink. In his holding cell, the reality of his situation finally hit him. His phone had been confiscated, but he could still see Calliope's last message burned into his memory. "I've accepted an immunity deal. I'm sorry, Alessandro, but I have to protect myself." Even his mistress, the woman he had betrayed his wife for, had abandoned him to save herself. The following weeks brought a cascade of betrayals. Board members he had golfed with for years now testified against him. Scientists detailed how he had pressured them to alter trial results. Former allies scurried to make deals with prosecutors, each one adding another nail to the coffin of his defense. His legal team, once the most expensive in Boston, began to withdraw as his assets were frozen. The few lawyers who remained were overwhelmed by the mountain of evidence. Evidence that had been quietly accumulated during his marriage by a woman who had understood that the best revenge was simply letting the truth come to light. From his cell in the federal detention center, Alessandro watched his empire crumble. Roberts Pharmaceuticals, the company his grandfather had founded with a single pharmacy in Boston's North End, was now worthless. The stock that had once been his family's legacy had been delisted, existing only as a cautionary tale in business ethics courses. His mother's visit was the hardest to bear. She sat across from him in the detention center's visiting room, her aristocratic Italian features lined with grief and shame. "Your father would be devastated," she said in Italian, her native tongue emerging in distress. "He built this company to help people, figlio mio, not to poison them for profit." "I thought I was protecting our legacy, Mama," Alessandro replied, his own Italian emerging as his carefully constructed American persona cracked. "No," she shook her head, tears in her eyes. "You destroyed it." Annika understood the true legacy, healing, helping, doing what's right. Perhaps that's why God gave her your daughter to raise. The mention of his daughter was a knife to his heart. Maya would grow up seeing her father's disgrace in history books, would learn about his crimes in business school case studies. The Roberts name, which he had fought so hard to protect, would now be synonymous with corporate fraud. The day he signed the plea agreement felt like another death, 15 years in federal prison in exchange for full cooperation. His remaining lawyers assured him it was the best deal he would get, that a trial would only expose more of his crimes to public scrutiny. That night, alone in his cell, Alessandro Roberts finally understood the true magnitude of his fall. He had lost not just his company and his freedom, but something far more precious, the respect of the woman who had once loved him enough to save his life, and the chance to watch his daughter grow up. The final blow came in the form of a newspaper slipped under his cell door by a sympathetic guard. There was Annika's picture, accompanying an article about her appointment to a prestigious FDA advisory committee. She was smiling, confident, free of the shadow he had cast over her life. The caption mentioned her role in exposing pharmaceutical fraud and her commitment to ethical medical research. In the end, Alessandro Roberts' fall wasn't just about losing his company or his freedom. It was about understanding too late that he had sacrificed everything meaningful, his integrity, his marriage, his chance to be a father, for an empire built on lies. His ex-wife hadn't needed to testify against him or publicly condemn him. She had simply preserved the truth, waiting patiently until the right moment to let it come to light. As the lights dimmed in his cell, Alessandro thought about blood. The blood Annika had refused to give Calliope, the blood that flowed through his daughter's veins, the blue blood of his Italian heritage that he had dishonored. In trying to protect his legacy, he had destroyed it. In trying to maintain his power, he had lost everything that truly mattered. The fall of Alessandro Roberts would be studied in business schools for years to come, not as a tale of corporate intrigue, but as a lesson in justice served through truth revealed. And somewhere in Baltimore, his ex-wife continued saving lives, their daughter growing strong under her care, proof that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well while letting karma take its course. Chapter 11. Sweet Justice. 5 years had carved deep lines into Alessandro Roberts' face as he sat in the upscale Baltimore cafe, waiting for the woman he had once called his wife. His normally immaculate Italian suit hung loose on his frame. Prison food and regret had taken their toll. His hands, once steady with corporate power, trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. The cafe had been Annika's choice, a neutral ground far from their shared history in Boston. Through the window, he could see Johns Hopkins Hospital rising against the skyline, her domain now, where she reigned as one of the most respected surgeons in the country. The irony wasn't lost on him that she had built her empire on healing, while his had crumbled under the weight of harm done. When Annika walked in, Alessandro barely recognized her. Gone was the soft elegance of a CEO's wife, replaced by the confident bearing of a woman who had come into her own power. Her surgical scrubs had been replaced by a tailored dress that spoke of authority rather than decoration, and her natural hair crowned her head like a victory wreath. "Alessandro," she said simply, sliding into the seat across from him. No kiss on the cheek, no warm greeting, just his name spoken with clinical detachment. "Annika," he replied, his Italian accent thickening with emotion. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." A waiter appeared with water and menus. Annika ordered an espresso, with the same precise tone she probably used in the operating room. Alessandro noticed she wore no rings on her fingers. She had never replaced their wedding band with another. "You look," he began, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "Let's not do that," she said. "You asked for this meeting. 5 years is a long time to wait to say whatever it is you need to say." He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his prison cell, but now the carefully prepared words felt hollow. "I was a fool," he whispered, his voice rough with regret. "I threw away everything that mattered for nothing." Annika took a sip of her espresso, her expression unchanged. "Is that what you came to tell me? That you regret your choices?" "I want to meet her," Alessandro said, his hands clenching under the table. "Maya, she's my daughter too. I have a right..." "Rights?" Annika's laugh was sharp enough to cut. "You lost any rights to Maya when you chose to risk her life before she was even born. When you violated my medical privacy, when you asked a pregnant woman to undergo a medical procedure for your mistress." The waiter, sensing the tension, quietly retreated without taking their food order. Through the window, the morning sun caught the windows of Johns Hopkins, making them glitter like the tears Alessandro was trying to hold back. "I've changed," he insisted. "Prison. It gives you time to think, to understand your mistakes." Mistakes? Annika set down her cup with surgical precision. Let's be clear about what happened, Alessandro. You didn't make mistakes. You made choices. You chose to falsify drug trials that put people's lives at risk. You chose to betray not just your marriage vows, but your company's entire mission of healing. He flinched at each precise hit, recognizing the same skill that had once made her such a brilliant surgeon. She was cutting away his defenses with practiced expertise. "How is she?" he asked softly. "Maya? Does she ask about me?" Something flickered in Annika's eyes, the first crack in her professional facade. "She's brilliant," she said after a moment. "Top of her class. She wants to be a doctor like me. She has your talent for languages. She's already learning Italian from my mother-in-law." The casual mention of a mother-in-law struck him like a physical blow. "You're married?" "Not yet," Annika replied. "But David and I are discussing it. He's chief of cardiology at Hopkins. He teaches Maya medical terms in Latin, treats her like his own." The image of another man teaching his daughter, loving his daughter, being the father he should have been, made Alessandro's chest tighten. "Please," he whispered, "just let me meet her once. Let me try to explain." "Explain what?" Annika leaned forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Explain how you violated her mother's medical privacy, how you risked her life in the womb for your mistress, how you built an empire on lies that could have killed countless patients." Alessandro slumped in his chair, defeated. "I was a fool," he repeated, the words tasting like ashes. "Yes," Annika agreed, "you were. But that's not why I agreed to meet you today." She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a document. "I have a proposition for you." The legal papers slid across the table like a sentence. Alessandro recognized the letterhead of his family's company, or what remained of it. Roberts Pharmaceuticals had emerged from bankruptcy proceedings as a shell of its former self, its valuable patents and research facilities sold off to competitors. "What is this?" he asked, though he could guess. "A chance at redemption," Annika replied. "Sign over controlling interest in what's left of Roberts Pharmaceuticals to my new medical research foundation. We'll rebuild it, but this time with a focus on ethical research, on making treatment accessible to underserved communities." Alessandro stared at the document, understanding dawning in his eyes. This had been her endgame all along, not just bringing him down, but transforming his family's legacy into something meaningful. "And if I sign," he asked, already reaching for the pen she held out, "then we can discuss supervised visits with Maya," Annika said carefully. "Not right away, but eventually. She should know her heritage, both the mistakes and the redemption." His hand trembled as he signed, watching his family name transfer to Annika's control. But there was a certain poetry to it. She had always been the true healer in their relationship. "I really did love you," he said as she gathered the papers. "Whatever else I did wrong, that was real." "I know," Annika replied, standing to leave. "That's what made your betrayal so perfect. It taught me that love isn't enough. Integrity matters more." She paused at the table's edge, reaching into her bag one more time. A photograph slid across the table, Maya in a Halloween costume, dressed as a tiny surgeon. She had his eyes but Annika's spirit, her pose radiating the confidence of a child who knew she was deeply loved. "She'll know about you when she's ready," Annika said softly. "Not the tabloid version or the case study version, but the whole truth, including this moment when you chose to put her future above your pride." As she walked away, her heels clicking against the cafe floor like a judge's gavel, Alessandro Roberts held the photo of his daughter and felt something he hadn't expected: hope. Not for himself, his mistakes had earned their consequences, but for the legacy that would rise from the ashes of his fall. Through the window, Johns Hopkins continued to glitter in the morning sun, a monument to healing that would now carry forward the reformed Robert's name under Annika's guidance. Sweet justice indeed, his empire transformed into something truly worthy of their daughter's inheritance. The espresso cups sat empty between them, the last remnants of their shared past. But something new had been born in this meeting, something that tasted less like revenge and more like redemption. Alessandro tucked the photo carefully into his jacket pocket, close to his heart, and finally understood that sometimes justice is sweetest when it creates something better than what it destroys. Chapter 12. The Final Cut. The Ultimate Victory. The Boston skyline glowed golden in the late afternoon sun as Annika Rose stood at the podium of the newly inaugurated Rose Medical Research Foundation. Below her, a sea of faces: medical researchers, journalists, former Roberts Pharmaceuticals employees, and most importantly, her 8-year-old daughter Maya, sitting in the front row between David and Alessandro. 5 years ago, Annika began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had made her legendary in operating rooms across 2 cities. I stood in this same building and made a choice, not between right and wrong. That choice had already been made for me by others' actions. No, I chose between mere survival and true transformation. The massive atrium, once dominated by corporate logos and stock tickers, now showcased breakthrough medical research and patient success stories. The Foundation's first major project was displayed prominently: a revolutionary treatment protocol for rare blood disorders, developed ethically and priced accessibly, a direct response to the lie that had shattered her marriage. Today, we're not just opening a new research foundation, she continued, her eyes meeting Alessandro's briefly. We're redefining what legacy means. It's not about names on buildings or stock portfolios. It's about the lives we touch, the healing we bring, the truth we protect. Maya beamed up at her mother, dressed in a miniature lab coat embroidered with Dr. Rose Roberts, junior researcher, a birthday gift from David that acknowledged both her heritage and her future. She had her father's aristocratic features and her mother's determined spirit, but most importantly, she had inherited something neither of them had possessed in their youth: wisdom about the true nature of power. The ceremony continued with the unveiling of the Foundation's mission statement etched in glass in the lobby: healing through truth, progress through integrity. Below it, smaller but equally significant, was the dedication: for Maya Rose Roberts, who taught us that the strongest bonds are not of blood, but of choice. As Annika prepared to cut the ribbon, surgical precision, always, she felt the weight of the journey that had brought them here. The betrayal that had nearly broken her had instead forged her into something extraordinary. The blood Alessandro had once demanded she give had instead nourished a revolution in medical research. "Before we officially open these doors," Annika said, holding the scissors with the same steadiness that had saved countless lives, "I want to acknowledge everyone who made this possible, including those who thought they were breaking me, but instead gave me the opportunity to rebuild something better." Her eyes found Calliope in the crowd, uninvited but present, watching from the back with an unreadable expression. The woman who had once tried to take everything from her had instead given her the push she needed to claim her true power. Annika nodded slightly, acknowledging the role even enemies play in our greatest transformations. The ribbon fell, and with it the last vestiges of Roberts Pharmaceuticals' troubled legacy. In its place stood something revolutionary, a research foundation that would prioritize ethics over profits, truth over convenience, healing over wealth. The crowd erupted in applause, but Annika's attention was on Maya, who had run to hug her. "You did it, Mommy," Maya exclaimed, her eyes shining with pride. "You fixed everything." "No, my love," Annika replied, smoothing her daughter's dark curls. "We built something new." something better. Later, in what had once been Alessandro's office, now transformed into a state-of-the-art research laboratory, the new board of directors gathered for their first official meeting. The familiar mahogany table remained, but instead of profit projections, it now held research proposals and patient advocacy plans. "Dr. Rose," one of the directors began, but Annika raised her hand. "Today, we're making one final change," she announced, revealing the Foundation's new logo. The Rose and Roberts names were intertwined around a medical caduceus, symbolizing the fusion of past and future, healing and hope. "This foundation belongs to all of us, including the next generation." She glanced at Maya, who was proudly showing David her latest drawing, a detailed sketch of the human heart, annotated in both English and Italian, combining her mother's medical knowledge with her father's linguistic heritage. Alessandro, who had earned his place on the board through genuine redemption and unwavering support of the Foundation's ethical mission, watched his daughter with quiet pride. He had lost an empire, but gained something far more precious, the chance to be part of a legacy truly worth passing on. As the sun set over Boston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of healing, rose gold like new beginnings, deep purple like hard-earned wisdom, Annika stood at the window of her new office. Below, the city that had witnessed her greatest pain now watched her greatest triumph. Her phone buzzed one last time with a message from Calliope. "You've won completely. The game is yours." Annika smiled, typing her response. It was never a game. It was always about healing, including you. She attached information about the Foundation's new blood disorder research program, then blocked the number permanently. Some circles needed to be closed with compassion rather than victory. The evening ended with a private dinner. Annika, Maya, David, and even Alessandro, all celebrating not just the Foundation's opening, but the complex, beautiful truth that families can be rebuilt, that healing comes in many forms, that the strongest legacies are built not on blood, but on choice. Maya fell asleep on the car ride home, clutching her junior researcher badge, dreaming perhaps of following in her mother's footsteps, not because of obligation or revenge, but because she had learned that true power lies in the ability to heal rather than harm. Annika carried her sleeping daughter into their home, where David had already prepared Maya's favorite breakfast for tomorrow. Heart-shaped pancakes, a surgeon's precise creation. The walls were lined with their combined achievements. Annika's medical breakthroughs, David's research papers, Maya's increasingly sophisticated anatomical drawings, and yes, even a few carefully chosen photographs of Alessandro, representing not what was lost, but what had been transformed. The final piece of the Foundation's transformation had been the most brilliant of all, not the destruction of Alessandro's empire, but its resurrection as something noble, not the punishment of those who had wronged her, but their rehabilitation into something better, not revenge served cold, but justice served with healing. As Annika tucked Maya into bed, her daughter stirred slightly. "Mom," she whispered sleepily, "are we heroes now?" "No, sweetheart," Annika replied, kissing her forehead. "We're healers, and that's better than any hero." The night settled over Boston, stars twinkling like hope above the city skyline. The Rose Medical Research Foundation stood as a beacon against the darkness, its lights burning late as researchers worked to fulfill its mission. But more importantly, it stood as a testament to the power of transformation, how the deepest wounds can become the strongest foundations, how betrayal can be transformed into blessing, how the sharpest cuts can lead to the most profound healing. The final cut had been made not with a scalpel but with wisdom, not in revenge but in revolution. And in the end, that was the most excellent victory of all, not the fall of an empire, but its rebirth as something truly worthy of the next generation. Queens don't just survive betrayal or build empires from its ashes. The truly great ones transform pain into purpose, wounds into wisdom, and broken dreams into beautiful realities. Annika Rose had done more than survive or succeed. She had shown the world that the most amazing victories come not from destroying what hurt us, but from building something so magnificent that the past becomes merely prologue to a greater story. The end was really just the beginning of something far more extraordinary than revenge could ever be. For in the final analysis, Annika Rose hadn't just won the game. She had changed its rules entirely, creating a legacy of healing that would touch countless lives for generations to come. And that was the most amazing victory of all. Subscribe if you liked.